Welcome to Passport to Everywhere with Indagare's Melissa Biggs-Bradley.
Melissa is the founder and CEO of Indagare, a travel and media company committed to inspiring and empowering people to change their lives and the world through travel, while having a positive impact on the places they visit. On the show, Melissa will transport you to dream destinations, share the latest travel news and trends, and introduce you to the most extraordinary people she has met on the road.
I really think that Japan functions like a symphony orchestra. So each person plays her part just perfectly, and they're all working from the same score, and the result is this very, very harmonious society.
Follow her behind the scenes to the world's most legendary hotels, and join us as she explores the future of travel.
Welcome to Passport to Everywhere.
If one could say that 2023 and 2024 have had an it destination, a place that seems to have captured everyone's travel fancy at the same time, it would have to be Japan. In my 30 years as a travel journalist, I've never seen such strong interest in visiting the Asian nation. There's been a renewed sense of wonder in the culture that still feels very mysterious, which is why I'm thrilled to be joined today by someone who's witnessed the recent shift firsthand, but is also a longtime and very keen observer of his adopted country. Pico Iyer is one of the most prolific and transcendental travel writers of our time. He's written 15 books that have been translated into 23 languages, and his TED Talk on the Art of Stillness has received more than 3.5 million views. Pico was born in Oxford, England. He attended the Magdalen College at Oxford and became a teaching fellow at Harvard, where he received a second master's degree. He's traveled the world always seeking transformative experiences of inner growth, which he details in his bestsellers like Video Night in Kathmandu, The Lady and the Monk, which is about Japan, The Global Soul, and The Open Road. He's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and the Financial Times. And I've been very lucky to have him write articles for me at Town & Country Travel and for Indagare's magazine. He's lived in Japan for over 30 years after an unassuming layover changed the trajectory of his life. And he later wrote A Beginner's Guide to Japan, a book covering his thoughts, conversations, and experiences in the country. He's brilliantly equipped with the language to describe a place as is, and he has mastered the art of true presence. Not only will we talk about Japan, but we'll dive into his thoughts on globalization, his time with the Dalai Lama, his recent book, The Half-Known Life, Finding Paradise in a Divided World, as well as his time traveling to Iran and the role of travelers in countries undergoing political unrest and change. I'm certain that we'll leave this conversation inspired. Plus, stick around for this week's Indagare Insight, where I will share some of our insider tips on making the most of your visit to Japan.
Join Melissa on the journey. You're listening to Passport to Everywhere. Here's your host, Melissa Biggs-Bradley.
I'm so looking forward to this. I feel like there's so many things I want to talk to you about. I would love to talk, obviously, about your thoughts on travel in the modern world. I want to talk about your most recent book, your experiences in Japan, and also kind of the role that travel plays in personal transformation, because you've written so beautifully about that topic, which is so dear to my heart. So we have lots to talk about, but I wanted to start with, in 2000, you wrote The Global Soul. And I loved that the premise about searching for home in the modern world. And in that book, you observed that globalization, even with global unity, and I think you said that in a world where we all watch the same TV shows and wear the same brands, there's been this resulting internal fragmentation of the individual. And that was more than 20 years ago that you wrote about that phenomenon of this growing number of full-time citizens of nowhere, you called them. And probably you and I fit that bill, truly born into a globalized world. How do you think that phenomenon has changed in the past 20 years, evolved or sort of accelerated?
I think acceleration is exactly the word. It's moved much faster and much further than ever I could have imagined. As you say, I brought out that book really the first month of the new millennium as a way to prepare us for the century to come. And I think for me, it was because previously I'd written about the crisscrossing of cultures when you go to McDonald's in Nepal or a yoga studio in New York City. And then I was more interested in the way that cultures crisscross inside ourselves. And as you were saying, so many of us are made of so many different places. And As we're speaking, 1,000 new people are being born into that community. Every time an American woman marries a man from Austria, suddenly the children emerging from that union belong to those places and many others. So I think it's actually making the world a much more interesting place. But you're right, it's harder and harder to define home because most of us have attachments to so many other places, and home becomes kind of a collage and a work in progress that we're constantly evolving. But I like the fact the world is moving in that direction. And my hope always is it can move us a little past the black and white or east and west divisions of the past, because we're made up of everywhere.
Yeah. And in The Half-Known Life, your latest book, you say early in the book that after years of travel, you'd begun to wonder what kind of paradise can ever be found in a world of unceasing conflict, which is sadly incredibly accurate at this moment in time. But whether the search for paradise might simply aggravate our differences. And I'm fascinated with this, and I'd love to have you elaborate a little bit for those who haven't read this book yet on what you explore in the book in that concept and what you discovered by thinking about paradise and conflict and that world that we live in.
Yeah, thank you for explaining it so perfectly. You're absolutely right. I think we all know as travelers it can be folly to search for paradise, but we all know as travelers we find it often, regardless of our searches, often by not looking for it. And as you said, it seems a little strange at first that I would be looking for paradise in places of great difficulty. But like many of the Indagare community, I think I've been lucky enough to spend time in the Maldives and the Seychelles and Tahiti, all the beautiful poster paradise places. And as you know, it's just heaven on earth to be sitting on a golden empty beach in the sun. But then night falls, and if it's truly an empty beach, it's probably crowded the next day, and it's not paradise for the people working very hard around you to make visitors feel at home. And so that's not really a paradise I can trust. But I thought if there was a paradise I could find in the middle of Times Square, or in the thick of Jerusalem, in the middle of the difficult world, that's one that really could withstand the realities of the world. And I wrote this book during the pandemic when all of us were suffering such anxiety and sorrow. But still, I didn't think I wanted to give up on hope or light or inspiration. I thought those are still possible. Every traveler knows that. How can I find paradise even in this very difficult time? And life is always probably going to be difficult in some ways. And I think one reason that I gave the book the title, The Half-Known Life, is that you and I and everybody at Indagare and most places see so much of the world now than even 25 years ago in the palm of our hand and our smartphones. And yet seeing Iran or Cuba or Jerusalem can actually keep us even further away from understanding them because we have the illusion of knowledge. And so I've always wanted to go and see the world firsthand, partly to remind myself how little I know. I remember when I was traveling in my 20s, I was a know-it-all. I'd go to Japan for 2 weeks and come back and tell my friends everything about Japan. And now I love the fact that the more I see, the more I appreciate how little I can ever know. And that's what makes the world so endlessly exciting. If we knew it, the conversation would be dead. But I've lived in Japan now, as you know, 36 years, and I feel I know less than when I arrived. And that's why every time I walk down the street, I don't know what to expect, and it becomes such an adventure. So I think the fact that the world is half known and our lives are half understood is where the possibility lies. It's sometimes scary, but it means that there's always a chance for growth and possibility.
Yeah, and isn't that part of getting older, is you realize how little you know instead of how much you know. To me, I think that's partly wisdom. But you mentioned Iran as an amazing example because you write about it in the book. We've both had the privilege of being there. And like you, I think it may be the best example of how, unfortunately, the media in this age of information makes us believe one thing that is so completely different from the reality. And I know you had a similar experience, but I remember when I went in 2016, it was actually on the anniversary of one of the day the American hostages had been taken. And the cover of one of the local papers of where I was leaving from, I think I was leaving from Zurich. I can't remember if it was Zurich or Vienna. And they had pictures of, huge crowds chanting, death to America in celebration of this day. And then I arrived in Tehran, and I've never arrived in a place where people were friendlier. From the minute, you walked out the door of the hotel, people would stop you and say, "Oh, wait, are you American?" I mean, I felt like I was a celebrity because of the number of people that would just stop and want to have a conversation. And it was such a disconnect between, people who said to me, "Aren't you afraid the Iranians hate us?" And I was like, no, the Iranians love, the people love us, and they love conversation and exchange. And so to me, it's such a great example, but how do we combat this? Because unfortunately, the more, as you know, people have the world in their hands, they think they know what the other is. And in fact, they really don't understand the other.
I love that, Melissa. I'm so glad you went there. And I think we combat it by just being there, doing what you did in 2016 or what I did in 2013. And I'm so happy that you mentioned Iran, because literally that is the highlight of my traveling life. I'd say it's the richest and most sophisticated place I've ever been. But most of all, as you said, the most unexpected. Again, I remember I flew from Santa Barbara, California through Istanbul. And I arrived in the holy city of Mashhad, 2:30 in the morning. When, as you read, I came out of customs and I was greeted by a man very elegantly dressed. He spoke better English than I do because he'd been educated at a boarding school near London before the revolution. He took me to this sumptuous hotel, again left over from before the revolution. The Yesterday by the Beatles was being piped through the lobby. I saw a little sign in one part of the lobby pointing to a small room that was a mosque, but right next to the mosque was this Swarovski jewelry shop and Yves Rocher store selling the latest beauty products from from Paris. I went up to my room and I turned on the TV. I thought, I'm so excited, my first chance to experience Iranian TV. There was Piers Morgan on CNN talking about gun control, none of which I'd expected. I thought, I've got to convey this to my friends. So I went online. The internet connection in the holy city was much faster than the one I'd had in Santa Barbara 2 days earlier. And then I went down for breakfast, and the lobby was filled for some reason with extremely elegant young women in their hijabs with the latest from Chanel and Dior under their hijabs, tapping away on their smartphones. And just as you say, I realized everything I thought and expected within 3 hours I found is wrong. And I never, as you suggest, could have understood that if I'd just stayed at home and watched CNN or read the New York Times. And what was especially humbling to me was I'd actually been writing about Iran without ever being there for 30 years. I financed my first book with a long article on Iranian history, and then later I published a whole novel partly set in Iran, though I'd never seen it. So I thought, I'm pretty well prepared. I've been reading and researching this place for as long as I can remember. And yet within 4 hours, as you can tell, I'd learned more than from 4 years of research. And within 16 hours, again, as you were saying, I saw I don't know a thing. And the people, wonderfully English fluent, as you say, very, very friendly and welcoming, and able to make a clear distinction between me and my government, as I was beginning to make a clearer distinction between them and their government. And I think the only way to cut through those simple two-dimensional images and restore sense of humanity and texture to the world is by going to see it. And it's interesting, I don't know if you had this experience, but when I came back to California, I was telling my friends how unexpected and surprising and glamorous Iran was. And they said, oh, that sounds wonderful. I think we'll go to Hawaii. In other words, it was very hard for me to persuade people that this really was a treasure.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I have traveled to Saudi a couple times in recent years, and it's a similar situation in that, the images and the understanding we have before going is just, it's total odds with the reality of when you arrive, and the complexity, but also, as you said, the humanity, the fact that, these are people who are living really interesting, nuanced lives that are so much beyond the categorization of what their government or their religion represents. And yet, when I come back and talk about how interesting and, the cultural heritage that's there, the rich history, people say, oh, that's interesting, but won't go. You wonder why. Why aren't people willing to or interested in seeing the things that they don't understand?
Beautifully said. I'm really envious. My publishers actually asked me just last week, which is the place you most want to go to? And I said instantly, Saudi, for that very reason, because I guessed it would be much more nuanced and more interesting than I imagined. And I think these days it's ever harder to remember that all the images in the world never can add up to real life. And that if we're seeing the world through a small screen, what we're really missing out on is the larger picture. And we're getting things in two dimensions instead of three. And I sometimes think that, for example, my grandparents many years ago, if they'd heard the name Saudi Arabia or Iran or Afghanistan, they wouldn't have had the illusion they know much about it. They may just have seen photographs of it, but they would say, we don't have a clue. But now you and I assume we do have a clue when really we probably don't. And I think that's why travel, which has always been a lovely luxury, is almost a necessity for those of us who can find the means and the freedom to travel. And I think what I often find is when I go to somewhere very interesting like Iran or Cuba or Tibet or Burma, the people I meet would do anything to come and visit New York City or Santa Monica, but we'll probably never have the chance. And so I really feel it's up to those of us in the more fortunate countries to take the initiative and start the conversation and go and see them. And as you mentioned, I wrote the book called The Global Soul because I do feel we're living in a global neighborhood. And in any neighborhood, whether it's a small one or a global one, the important thing is to go and meet the neighbors, find out who they are, tell them who you are. And the really scary person in any neighborhood is the one who cowers or shouts behind the sofa and locks the doors and closes the curtains. So it's a wonderful adventure, and it's always an exciting education travel, but I think it's also an important part of navigating our planetary world.
Absolutely right. Beautifully said. And I think just to encourage you to go to Saudi as soon as you can, one of the things that I found the most interesting about visiting in the last few years is that it's a country much like, I would compare it maybe to China when it was coming out of strict communism, a little bit like South Africa coming out of apartheid, but even more dramatic, or Germany with the Berlin Wall coming down. It's a country that's in the midst of massive cultural and social change that's happening at such a quick speed. I mean, they were isolated for the past 50 years from the West to all of a sudden now be joining and embracing the West is just an interesting to watch the transformation. And, one of the themes in your half-known life that I thought was so interesting was this concept, and you talked about it with Kashmir, is the role that travelers have in maybe being complicit in the evolution, and in the place of something like Kashmir, even the dilution of a culture of a place. And I remember in the section about Kashmir, you wrote about how the area had opened up to visitors in the idea that prosperity and tourism were going to help those who have been through tough times. But at the same time, I think that what you said was to come here as a foreigner was to be complicit in the denial of a resolution, because there are all these places, Kashmir being a great example, where their political and social fate is in the balance. There's many places, obviously, right now, this is going on in a lot of the Middle East. So what is our role when a country is in the midst of change or in the midst of flux as travelers?
Well, I think my first question whenever I'm thinking of going somewhere is, would the people at the other end rather see me or not? And my sense is that in almost every case, they'd say yes. And the more impoverished or the more imprisoned a country is, the more I think they're grateful for foreigners and visitors. I run into this a lot with Myanmar, for example, where every penny I'm spending there maybe is going towards the government that is oppressing people. But I feel not to go there is to commit the people of Myanmar, who are some of the most engaging, cloudless, angelic souls I've ever met, to kind of solitary confinement. It's more or less saying the world is going to forget you and you're going to be completely cut off. And I've always had great faith in just the regular tourist being an emissary and being a kind of walking newspaper and breathing television set, because people in Myanmar or Iran or Tibet want to learn about us as much as we want to learn about them. And to cut them off from the world, I think, is really a kind of inhumanity and is often exactly what their governments most want to do. So I think just when I'm walking down the street in Yangon in Myanmar and I meet somebody there, I feel a small window is opening in his life. He knows he's not going to be forgotten. He knows his story is going to be taken out to the US and the rest of the world. And he just feels that he's not alone in the way that he might otherwise be. As you know, I've spent 49 years now talking and traveling with the Dalai Lama. And I'm struck that whenever anybody says to him, what can we do for Tibet? He says just one thing, please go there. Just go there. Don't listen to my propaganda. Don't listen to the Beijing's propaganda. Please go and just tell us what you hear and feel and see. And that's enough. So I do feel you're right that tourists are often walking a tightrope, and to some extent we can be manipulated by the governments that are inviting us. But insofar as the governments are not the same as the people, even as we're being manipulated by the governments, I think we're often extending an important service to the people. And, I've been to North Korea, and the terrifying thing about that country is that its people are really allowed no access to the rest of the world. And apart from anything, Kashmir, as you know, probably is a beautiful place to visit. It's fraught, and there are places where you can see it's a war zone. But if you're sitting on a houseboat on Dal Lake with exquisite spices being brought in little boats to your houseboat and people playing Sufi music as you sit on the sun deck, few places more transporting, even as you're getting an important education about a place that's in the news.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, and both of us have obviously been to places that have sanctions against them, whether it's Cuba or Myanmar or Iran, where there are plenty of people who would argue that one shouldn't go. And like you, I've asked many times the local people, do you think we should be staying away? And they, to a person, have said, no, please tell my story. They don't want to be silenced and they don't want to be hidden from view. And so that's what we can do for them. I completely agree. I'm curious, you mentioned in the book that you're traveling with the Dalai Lama, and you just mentioned it again. In all the years that you've traveled with him, are there one or two kind of moments that stand out as particularly profound experiences for you as sort of a witness of him in the world?
Well, I think the joy of being with the Dalai Lama is almost every moment is like that, just seeing how he walks through the world. So, sometimes I've gone shopping with him for a new pair of eyeglasses in a busy Yokohama shopping mall. And we'll step into an elevator and he'll just rub the elevator operator's arms. I mean, instantly he's reaching out to just an elevator operator saying, you're my friend that we've never met before. When we're driving across Japan, because I travel with him every time he comes to Japan, there'll be 2 or 3 cars in the convoy, and we'll stop along the freeway or the highway at a convenience store, and he'll buy the handful of people who are in his entourage a cup of tea. And then he'll stand at the front door of the convenience store, greeting every bewildered truck driver who enters, who probably doesn't know who the Dalai Lama is or what he represents, but just feels, well, here's a smiling, friendly soul. And he's so good at being a natural democrat and reminding us of all that we share and turning himself into a human being rather than the head of state and esteemed religious presence that he is. And so I think I've learned a lot from him. And most of all, maybe in the context of travel, that whenever he's traveling the world, I feel he's traveling to learn rather than to lecture. And his first impulse is to ask people questions about their places rather than to start pontificating. And I'm remembering, as you ask me this, every morning when my wife and I go into his hotel room at 8:30 in the morning to start his official day, wherever we happen to be, I always notice 2 things. The first is a well-worn copy of the day's newspaper, because he keeps better contact with the news than even I do as a journalist. But the second thing is a telescope pointed out the window, because he knows that everywhere he goes in the world is going to offer him a slightly different perspective on the heavens. Wherever he goes, he's going to see something that he couldn't see elsewhere. And I think that's the great spirit that every traveler wants to take. Never to take anywhere for granted, and just to remember wherever you are, sometimes quite difficult or inconvenient places, you're actually enjoying a moment or having an angle on the world you would never get anywhere else.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you mentioned when he comes to Japan, and I know that you've been there now, as you said, for more than 30 years. And one of the things I love when you described falling in love with Japan, you said it was the most inward and subtle culture that you had yet met, which I think is just such a beautiful way to describe what I know of that culture. But I would love to hear about how the country has changed since you first moved there and your relation to it has changed.
I think it's, as you know, because you've been here many times, I think, it's constantly changing on the surface. And I don't think it changes much deep down at all, which is part of the beauty and fascination of the place. I sometimes think of Japan as an old man in a Planet Hollywood t-shirt, meaning he's very cool. He's up to the minute with all the global fashions. He's very sleekly dressed, but he's no less old and no less Japanese for that. And for example, you're talking to me now in the little apartment where I live. It's a completely Western style apartment in a completely Western style suburb. All the buildings around me look as if we're in suburban Los Angeles. But the center of the big city where I live, Nara, so 20 minutes away by car, is the largest municipal park in Japan. And as you probably know, the center of Nara is nothing but temples and shrines and groves of wild plum trees and sutra houses, and particularly 1,200 wild deer who wander around downtown ruling the place. You go to City Hall and there are two deer sitting on the steps. You check into the Nara Hotel and you don't see doorman, you see doe when you step outside. And so it's a wonderful image to me of how on the fringes that Japan sometimes looks more like the US than the US does, but at its heart, it's in the 8th century still, which is what makes it so fascinating. And I've been thinking recently about how one of the graces of Japan is to speed towards the 22nd century, because nowhere is more futuristic in certain ways, without feeling it has to leave behind the 8th century. And like India in a very different way, and other places, maybe Iran too, it's able to inhabit many centuries at once and be extremely contemporary without shedding its past. And in terms of how my relation to Japan has changed, I mean, so I arrived 36 years ago from New York City, hoping to live in a temple for a year. And my 3rd week here, I met my wife to be. So I suppose living in a Japanese neighborhood with a Japanese wife and 2 Japanese stepchildren, I've come to see the place from within somewhat, even though I will always be an outsider. And I think the longer I've been here, the more I see how much Japan is rooted in the past. I think when I first arrived, it was all the dazzling, cool services and the vending machines and the ingenious innovations that struck me and the new technologies. And now I see that they're really all on the surface. And deep down, for example, my wife, who is often to be seen in a black leather jacket riding a motorbike around and has been to most of the countries in the world now, every morning when she wakes up, she heats some tea and gathers their favorite food to put out for her parents, who died 5 and 10 years ago. And whenever she has free time, she'll go out to the shrine or to the family grave to speak to her long departed grandmother. And so I think the longer I've been here, the more I see how close Japan is to its ancestral roots, to its most ancient traditions, which I think is a wonderful thing, and probably begins to explain why the sense of harmony, the sense of safety, the sense of service is still just so impeccable, I think, in a league of their own.
Yeah, I love that description of sort of the 8th century and the modern at the same time. And you just hinted out something that I found really interesting in your book, A Beginner's Guide to Japan. You wrote about this kind of collective mindset that exists in Japan, and that you really learned about the power of the we mindset. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that, because I do think that's part of what strikes people, even if they can't articulate it when they arrive in Japan, as one of the differences to the West in one of the most striking ways.
Yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why I decided when I was 29 to leave New York City to come here, because growing up in England and then the US, I felt I'd been schooled very strongly in the I culture, and I wanted to complement it with the we culture. And I really think that Japan functions like a symphony orchestra. So each person plays her part just perfectly, and they're all working from the same score. And the result is this very, very harmonious society in which each person fades within the larger orchestra, but is doing her thing impeccably. And I think that's one reason why Japan traditionally hasn't always known what to do with us foreigners, because we come in and we don't have a copy of that score, and perhaps we don't even read music. And so we threaten to disrupt this exquisite harmony that's been built up over 1400 years. But I love the we culture. And one small example is that soon after I moved into this apartment, I started going every week to play ping pong with my mostly elderly neighbors. And my first surprise is we always play best of 2 sets. So usually the score's 1-1. There's no winner and there's no loser. We only play doubles. We never play singles. We change our partners every 5 minutes. So if you happen to win a game now, you'll probably lose 6 minutes later with a new partner. And of course, we always keep score to make sure that the games are interesting, but nobody keeps track of who's winning the games. And so at the end of the evening, when I come home and my wife says, "How was it?" I always say fantastic, because I don't know whether I've won or lost. I just know that the society is constructed to make everybody feel like a winner and to ensure that nobody is falling behind or out of the group. And I sometimes think how when I go back to California, I sometimes do play singles with my English arch rival. And if I happen to defeat him, I can't sleep at night because I know he's plotting revenge. And if he happens to defeat me, I can't sleep all night because I remember I missed that easy shot in the third game. In Japan, I sleep very, very well because I'm not thinking of winning or losing. All I'm aware of is I'm part of this group of 20 or 30 people. And even in this competitive sport, at some level, we're all playing together. And we're all playing together the way instruments play together to create something larger than the sum of their parts. And I think this probably comes from the Confucian tradition, and you find variations of it in China and South Korea, North Korea, other places in East Asia. But Japan, as you know, has brought it to an unusually kind of refined perfection. So I feel very lucky to be here.
This is Passport to Everywhere. We'll be right back after the break.
I'm Melissa Biggs Bradley, and you're listening to today's episode of Passport to Everywhere with one of my favorite travel writers, Pico Iyer. Be sure to keep listening for this week's Indagare Insight, where I share all the best tips for a trip to Japan.
Passport to Everywhere with Melissa Biggs Bradley continues. Listen to new episodes every Thursday on all podcast platforms.
I love that as a metaphor for the culture. And yet, as a visitor, it would be very hard to pick up on that. I would not have learned that. And yet, I do feel of all the places that I visited, probably that have had the most profound effect on me in terms of how maybe expanding my skills at looking at the world, I would say probably France, India, and Japan have had the biggest impact at different stages in my life of hearing new scores or having access to new languages. And yet the collectiveness wouldn't have been part of it. I mean, in some ways for me, what I found so perspective shifting was the role of ritual and gratitude, and how that sort of, or how gratitude is woven into ritual in Japan in a way that really slowed me down and made me reconsider how I take a bath every day or some of these kinds of things. And that for me was what was so profound. But I'm curious what you think in general it is about Japan that casts a spell over Westerners, because they don't get incorporated into the collective mindset. They're still at a distance to that. And yet I don't know anyone who goes to Japan and comes home the same.
I love that. Yes. And I think what you're saying makes me think about attention to detail and graciousness, which I think are two of the sovereign qualities of Japan that hit every visitor. That even if you go to a convenience store, the way the young woman who may have, rings all over her nose and ear and is sporting the latest fashions of Los Angeles, but the way that the graciousness with which she hands over your Kit Kat or your can of Coke as if it were a sacred object, and the way that how whatever fashions they're sporting, the degree of politeness and care and thoughtfulness is so consistent wherever you go. I think that always humbles me very, very much. And I think it comes from that Shinto background, which believes that there's a spirit in everything, even a can of Coke or a bar of Kit Kat, and therefore it has to be handled with reverence and care. My wife will tell me that when she was a little girl, if she kicked the table when the family was having dinner, her father would say, "You have to apologize to that table. It has a spirit. It has a soul. Kicking the table is like kicking your brother. It's done nothing to hurt you. And it's helping you have a dinner. How can you be so unkind to it?" And that spirit, though it's invisible, I think means, as you said, when you talk about thank you, they have ceremonies in Kyoto to thank sewing needles for giving themselves up to making kimono or sweaters or whatever it might be. And just this notion that everything is animate and therefore is worthy of care and respect makes for a very different universe. And as you say, somebody coming for 2 weeks isn't necessarily going to see that, but I think they can feel it. And I think if somebody were to ask me, why do I live in Japan? And they sometimes do, I'd say kindness is the first answer. and order and thoughtfulness. And my sense soon after I came here, I noticed that if I was having tea with a Japanese person, all her attention was on making sure I was as comfortable as possible. She wasn't foisting on me her dogmas or needs or whatever. She was just the perfect host, trying to make me feel at ease. And if I ordered Earl Grey tea, I knew that were I to come to her house 10 years later, she'd have Earl Grey tea waiting for me. That degree of attentiveness and that degree of selflessness, I suppose, is very different. And as you say, a visitor wouldn't necessarily pick up on this, but I noticed soon after I came here that whenever I walked down the street, I would reflexively start picking up any piece of trash I saw there. Now, I would never do that in New York City, and I wouldn't even reach the end of the block if I'd tried to do it in New York City. But I love what you said about France, India, and Japan. I remember when the Rugby World Cup was held here in Japan 4 years ago. At the end of it, a BBC announcer said, you know, the thing about Japan is it really makes me want to be a better person. It really makes me think if everybody in this country can live with such grace and courtesy and efficiency, why can't I? And maybe this is something I should aspire to. And I think Japan has that effect on a lot of us. And I felt that when I came here, I was almost visiting a wise elder that I thought had certain things to teach me that I couldn't learn in New York City or London.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said. And I'm curious because we are seeing a huge interest in Japan. I mean, in all the 30 years that I've been covering travel, I've never seen it be quite the darling of the zeitgeist as it is right this minute. I'm curious if you have thoughts on why that is.
You're so right, Melissa. I mean, the number of international tourists has gone up 15-fold in the last 20 years, and I think 5-fold in the last 8 years where I live. And it's true, just as you say, 20 years ago, even my editors in New York were scared of calling me up in Japan. Nobody I knew ever came. And I think the sense was Japan was very expensive, very foreign, and that people didn't speak much English. And the fact that the yen is very weak now means it's the opposite of expensive. In fact, we're seeing a lot of, as you know, backpackers, the people who used to go to India and Thailand are now coming to Japan because I can have a sumptuous 3-course meal for $6, no tip, no tax above that. I think Google Translate has actually made quite a difference because, as you know, the Japanese are very shy about speaking English, though most have learnt it for 6 years in school. But thanks to Google Translate, any visitor can read the menus or convey to a taxi driver what she needs. And I think people are just discovering it's so safe, it's so kind, and it's so different. Japan is not like anywhere else in the world. It's like traveling to another planet, but it's not very expensive, and you don't have to worry about the precautions you might be taking in many other, even fairly developed countries in the world. I don't know, what do you think? What are your explanations for the popularity?
I think all of those things that you mentioned are part of it. I also think, in a way, with the world feeling so chaotic and unpredictable, there seems to be a stability and a known predictability to Japan that makes people feel safe. I also think that the lockdown was so interesting in terms of really forcing people to understand their priorities of where they wanted to go, and the realization for many that, you know, if it's all taken away, what are the places I wish I had seen? And Japan didn't open up for a long time, and I think it was very high on the list of places that people realized that they wanted to go. So I think there's a number of those things in that.
Yes, it's so interesting you say that, because exactly so. I think the country finally opened on October 12th of last year. And by October 23rd, I could barely walk through certain streets in Kyoto. It was so crowded. In other words, everybody had this pent-up longing around the world to come here. And the other thing that we've really been noticing, which I think is a happy development in travel, is that so many visitors are coming from India, Thailand, Mexico, Brazil, places where not many people had the resources or chance to travel to places like Japan 25 years ago, as well as, of course, as China and South Korea. So we're getting people from everywhere in the world, as well as all my friends from New York City who never used to come here.
Now, you have written a lot about transformative travel and how you have that wonderful quote about wanderlust is it's not about people wanting to cross all over the globe, but it's people who are committed to transformation. And I completely agree with you. To me, that is the beauty of travel, is that it can change us and make us better people and make the world a better, more connected place. But Do you have advice for those people who are seeking transformative travel experiences? Have you, over the years, noticed that there are practices that enable that, and there are practices that might, be obstacles to really transforming yourself through travel?
Interesting. I think recently I've been thinking that even if you're traveling with a friend or partner or in a group, try to spend 2 hours every day by yourself. Partly so you can have your own adventures, partly so you can have time to process everything that you're seeing and feeling, partly so that you can come back and share your adventures with that person or that group and they can share them with you. Because I found it's really only when I'm by myself that I have the chance deeply to be moved. And it's only when I'm walking down a street by myself that people from that country will come up and approach me. If they see me with my wife or my mother, they'll assume I'm well taken care of. But so I think there's a great virtue in spending even a little bit of the day alone. I always tell my friends to leave their assumptions at home, as you and I did when going to Iran, or even if you take them with you, they'll be upended, we hope, as soon as you get off the plane. And I always find it useful, this is a little different from your question, but to set myself an assignment and to ask a question of the country I'm visiting, even if it's one I never hope to get an answer to. So I remember when I first came to Japan as a traveler for 2 weeks, I asked almost the same question that you were asking a few minutes ago, which is how does the old play off against the new here? And how does Japan take American things and make them very Japanese? And so during my 2 weeks, I did all the things any visitor would want to do. I walked around the temples of Kyoto and I visited Tokyo Disneyland and I went to see the very moving memorial at Hiroshima. I did the normal 2 week trip. But in the back of my mind, I was always keeping an eye out to those questions I had set for myself. And so at the end of it, I felt that I'd really had a conversation with the place rather than just taking it in. And I always feel that travel isn't a passive experience like going into a theater and seeing a concert or play or movie. It's a dialogue. And I don't know, again, if this answers your question, but I always feel when I go somewhere, I'm meeting a fascinating stranger and I have 16 hours or 16 days to get to know her. All I want to do is find out everything about her, ask her what she likes, find out about her history, ask her what her dreams are. And it sounds very abstract when you're talking about a culture like that, but I think just coming to it with a real spirit of inquiry and curiosity and figuring that I'm only here in, let's say, Saudi Arabia for 10 days. I just want to walk the streets as much as possible and ask everybody I meet as many questions as possible.
Yeah, no, I've heard you refer to saying that places have charisma, and I completely agree with you, even to the extent where sometimes I can get off a plane for the first time and have an instinctual reaction in the same way you do when you meet a person of knowing, oh my gosh, we're going to be friends forever. Or, okay, I'm not sure I'm going to want to spend a lot of time with this person again after a certain amount of time. But we have these connections with places that are very energetic and soulful.
Yes, I mean, you probably know, but maybe not everybody listening to this knows. I was living in New York City in my mid-20s, and I had a business trip in Hong Kong. And when I was flying back to JFK, I had a layover at Narita Airport near Tokyo. And I'd never been to Japan before. And I didn't want the layover, I just wanted to be back home. But there I was, stuck in Narita for 20 hours. So Japan Airlines put me up at an airport hotel. I had dinner, I went to sleep, I woke up, I had breakfast. I still had 4 hours to kill before my flight. And I saw a little sign in the lobby offering a free shuttle bus into the town of Narita. And I thought, airport towns are not famous for their fascination. I've been to Queens, I've been to Hounslow, they're not the senses of excitement. But what else am I going to do in these 4 hours? And I'll probably never be in Japan again. So I just took this trip into the center of town and I walked around for 2 hours. And on the basis of that, by the time I was boarding my plane, I decided I was going to move to Japan. And it took me 3 years to extricate myself from my job, but I did. And now I've been here 36 years. And it was just what you're talking about, that instant sense of affinity, like meeting a stranger and feeling I've known her all her life. And as I was standing outside the temple in Narita, I thought, I know this place and it knows me. And if I don't spend time here and see what the nature of this connection is, something in me is going to be unsettled for life. I'll always be an exile. And so later I thought it's so funny that an airport town, of all things, not the Taj Mahal or not the Golden Temple, changed my life entirely. So a reminder to myself never to overlook even the most trivial opportunity or even an invitation just to visit an airport town, because it can open a door to something that changes with the rest of your life. And so, as you said, it's just really the discovery of an affinity. And so the other thing that's so wonderful about these days, especially as more and more people are working from home, as I do, is that you can not only find a foreign place and feel that connection with that place and decide you want to spend time there, but you can even live there. I've chosen to live for 36 years pretty much on a tourist visa in Japan because it's the place that feels like my secret home. It's the place that makes sense to me. And again, I realize in the pre-technological era, I'd have been able to visit for 2 weeks maybe, but not much more than that.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Pico, your book, The Art of Stillness, which really took the whole world by storm. Can you talk about how your life in Japan probably opened you to that practice, but certainly deepened it?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think what really struck me that day in Narita Airport and moved me to decide to come to Japan was that it does seem, you mentioned the word slow before when talking about the effect Japan had on you. And for all the crowds and the bustle and the energy, it seems like a quiet, contemplative place, very different from the other beautiful places that I'd seen. I was talking to a Japanese friend recently who's traveled the world for 35 years. And I said, what do you think is special about Japan? He said, it's a silent place. Anyone who's been on a crowded Japan Airlines plane or a jam-packed train in Tokyo knows that even when it's very crowded, you can hear a pin drop off and it's absolutely quiet, which gives you a lot of space. And you mentioned earlier inwardness and subtlety, and it makes a huge space for inwardness. And since I'd been living in the center of Manhattan, which is a place of great energy, but not so much opportunity for me for inwardness, it seemed like the perfect corrective and complement to Manhattan. So I think Japan, yes, did increase something in me that was there already, that was this longing for a quieter, slower life. And so we live, my wife and I, for 31 years now, just in this 2-room apartment. We don't have a car. I've never had a cell phone. And it's amazing that the day seems to last for 1,000 hours. Nearly all my life when I'm here takes place within about a 3-square-block radius. And 1,000 things I don't have to worry about since I don't have a car. Very few distractions since I don't have a cell phone. And certainly a perfect environment in which to write. But I think what I've always appreciated about Japan, and you will have seen this on your trips here, is the mix of tranquility and energy. Because as I'm sitting here, just outside my window, people are going places, doing things. Everybody in Japan is filling their days, but in a very, very quiet and self-contained way. So there's very little friction. It's, as you said, I think that part of the appeal in a time of disruption and of warfare is you come here, and even though everyone is working so hard to make things work perfectly, you don't get any sense of stress or agitation, because at least they're not articulating it. So yeah, I'm very grateful. I think New York City taught me wonderfully about energy, and Japan has taught me about the beauty of sitting still.
It's amazing. And do you have advice for people who are the first time they go to Japan, how they should prepare for a trip in terms of, making the most of it or understanding the historical context? Are there books that you've loved or ways that you would recommend a friend prepare?
3 things come to mind. I mean, first, in terms of an itinerary, I sometimes almost tell my friends to skip Tokyo. It's a very sleek and stylish. It's one of the nicest big cities in the world. But if you're familiar with Hong Kong or Shanghai or New York City, you may feel you've already got a taste of the big city. And I would base myself in Kyoto. And I can tell you more about places in Japan that I would recommend. But Kyoto is a bustling big city, and people are often taken aback that it looks as full of high-rises and taxis as Detroit. But as you know, it's ringed by 3 hills that contain 1,600 temples and 17 World Heritage Sites. So unlike Tokyo, Kyoto is offering you something you'll never find anywhere else in the world, especially if you stay in a ryokan, a traditional inn. In terms of reading material, to me, the best foreign guide is a late American writer called Donald Ritchie, who lived here for 66 years. He came in the occupation and stayed till his death in 2013. And he knew how to find exactly the perfect distance with Japan. So he was endlessly fascinated, sometimes amused by it, very affectionate towards it, but he knew he was always an outsider. And he wrote about films and sex and temples and cities, everything. And there's a book called The Donald Ritchie Reader, which I think is a perfect introduction to the way the Japanese think and operate. My literary agent from New York was recently visiting, and she told me one very handy practical tip, which is Japanese trains and stations are not made for big baggage. There aren't porters, there aren't carts, and the Japanese seem to travel quite lightly. So if you are coming to Japan and moving around a lot, apart from getting a Japan Rail pass, which is invaluable, which will allow you unlimited travel for a week or 2 weeks for the less than the price of Tokyo-Kyoto return. Be aware if you're carrying big bags, a lot of people will send them ahead by the equivalent of Federal Express. So when you leave Tokyo, you send your bags to the next stop and they'll be waiting for you because handling them on the trains is difficult. And the two places I always tell my friends to visit, I think 2 weeks is a good time to visit Japan, good space of time to visit because it's a compact country and the trains are very quick. The two places I always recommend are Naoshima, which is this beautiful old fisherman's island that's been turned into a complex of museums and art installations, and Koyasan, which is a mystical mountain in the center of Japan, not far from Osaka and Kyoto, which you ascend by cable car. And at the top, there are just 117 temples and tall, tall trees that have been there for centuries, and 200,000 graves. It's a very strong, intense, compact place. And whoever you are, when you go there, you stay in a temple, sleep on tatami, eat the monks' extremely tasty vegetarian food. Some of the temples are quite sumptuous, and just walk around this town that's full of nothing but temples and graves. And it's almost as potent as anything I've seen in Tibet. And what's interesting to me is Naoshima is full of these sort of 22nd century museums that look like the last word in cutting edge architecture. And Koyasan is from the 9th century and hasn't changed much in the last 12 centuries. But somehow they complement one another very well. And I think round out what you might see otherwise in Tokyo or Kyoto.
I love that itinerary. I've been lucky to go to Kyoto and Naoshima, but now I have a new spot to add to my list. And if you had to try to sum up the greatest blessing of travel for you, what would it be?
Well, it partly goes back to where we began this conversation. Travel reminds me how much I don't know and how much I can never know. And that's a delight because it reminds me just how much is out there. Recently, I've been thinking that my life feels a little bit like a little tent up in the Himalayas at night. And I may have a flashlight and there may be a lantern or two at the tent, but it's this little piece of light surrounded by this vast darkness and maybe the silver outline of the peaks behind me. And that's how I think of my stance in the world. I know about this much, and there's this huge vastness outside that I don't begin to know about. And that's what's endlessly exciting, the fact that I can never be on top of it. And that's really one of the things I like about Japan, that it, as I said, it does feel like a foreign planet to me. And it means that every day when I go to the supermarket, I don't know exactly what I'm going to see. And I'm sure there are always going to be surprises. And I come back after a 3-minute trip there with more notes to take or some new understanding about Japan. And when I was living in England or New York City, I had the illusion, oh, I pretty much know how these places work. But in a place like Japan, I never have that illusion. And I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Well, thank you so much, Pico. I could talk to you for hours, but I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited to have you sharing your perspective with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for Indagare. It's wonderful that you spent all these many 30 years or maybe more trying to encourage people to see the world and giving them ways that they can see it in comfort and safety. And as both of us have been saying, I can't think of any activity both more fun and more essential in the global planet. So I'm glad both of us are on this path and so many others are joining us.
Yeah, well, we are very lucky. And again, I love the inspiration. Just your books make, not only do they make people want to travel, but you really allow people to be with you on these incredible journeys. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today to listen and learn from Pico Iyer. I hope this insightful conversation leaves you feeling encouraged and inspired. For more on Pico and to learn about his work, head to www.picoiyerjourneys.com. Thanks for sticking around. I'm thrilled to share this week's Japan-inspired Indagare Insights.
Here are this week's Indagare Insights.
It was such a pleasure speaking to Pico about Japan at a time when the country is such a popular destination for our travelers. For this week's Indagare Insight, I thought it would be the perfect time to share some of our insider tips for visiting the country and for experiencing its beauty firsthand. At Indagare, we plan travel all around the world for our members, and our team's expertise spans many, many countries. But to put it in perspective just how in-demand travel to Japan is right now, I can tell you that based on our own booking trends, Japan is ranked to be Indagare's 5th most booked country in 2024, which is an even more impressive statistic when I say that the 4 countries currently standing ahead of it are France, Italy, the UK, and Mexico. All 4 of which are not only easier to reach for our primarily North American-based members, but they're all also much easier to navigate. The interesting part about Japan's surge is that the total visitors to Japan, though, are still down compared to pre-pandemic levels, making now the perfect time to visit, as interest continues to rise, but before the country gets really busy and more crowded. Plus, right now the yen, which is the currency of Japan, is weak, so it makes a trip all the more enticing, especially for budget-conscious travelers. Given that Japan is booming right now, though, it's not a destination that you can plan last-minute travel to. Hotels and top guides are booked out months in advance. So if you're considering visiting, get in touch with your Indagare trip designer as soon as possible to start the planning process. So when you're thinking about when to go, I think there's a number of factors to consider. Summers in Japan are extremely humid and best to be avoided. The early fall, end of September and all of October, is one of the best times to travel to Japan because you're catching it after the summer heat and before November's really busy autumn foliage rush. The time of the golden leaves is almost as popular as cherry blossom season. Otherwise, winter is an underrated time for travel to Japan, as there are a fair amount of sunny days and fewer visitors. And for skiers, Nusiko is the land of legendary light, fluffy powder, and from December to March, it receives some of the most consistent snow in the world, meaning there is fresh powder almost daily. I would avoid Golden Week, which falls towards the end of April through early May, just because of the crowds. And of course, around that same time, there's also the cherry blossom season, which varies year by year, but it typically falls from the end of March into April, and sometimes even May. This year, except for the northernmost part of the country, which is peaking this week, most regions are past peak bloom. They really saw their best flowers in the first few weeks of April. Depending upon how you feel about the cherry blossoms, March, April, and May might be the perfect time to plan your trip, in hopes of catching the beautiful pink petals. Or it might be another period to avoid because of the crowds. If you are hoping to see the sakura, it's important to note that peak bloom can never be guaranteed. This is nature, after all. So you can pay attention to the forecast all you'd like, but as it did this year, a cold front might sweep in at the last minute and delay the bloom. In terms of where to go, I recommend spending time in the countryside as well as the cities. There are 27 direct flights from the United States into Japan, and the vast majority of them come into Tokyo. As such, most of our members begin their Japanese adventures there, in the world's largest city by population. Some of our favorite Tokyo hotels include the Mandarin Oriental, the Aman, and the brand new Janu Tokyo, which is a subset of the Aman brand, which just opened in March. And it aims to attract a hipper, more wellness-focused guest than the traditional Aman goer. Be sure to visit Indagare.com for an in-depth Tokyo destination guide with complete hotel reviews of many hotels and many other articles, like our Top Tables article, which features Indagare's favorite restaurants in one of the best cities in the world for foodies. This year, Tokyo has the most Michelin-starred restaurants of any city in the world, with 251 total stars awarded to 194 different restaurants. And if you want to switch it up, you could fly into Osaka and visit Kyoto first. There are even a few direct flights to Osaka from various cities in the U.S., like Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, and Seattle, San Francisco, and a few others on the West Coast. Kyoto is known as Japan's cultural epicenter, and starting there allows you to see the history first, which gives you a strong foundation for the rest of your trip. Generally, it's worth noting that Kyoto has been grappling recently with over-tourism, though. So we do recommend really early morning touring in Kyoto, arriving at the most popular shrines like Fushimi Inari Taisha by 6 a.m. to beat the crowds. If you start your itinerary in Kyoto, this is a great first morning activity because the jet lag is going to be working to your advantage. Like Tokyo, we have lots of articles on Kyoto and recommendations for hotels, restaurants, sites, and everything else. 75% of Japan is mountainous, so no visit is really complete without a stay in the mountains somewhere. Hakone, which is between Tokyo and Kyoto, is a great option to experience a more traditional Japanese lifestyle. If you add Hakone to your itinerary, I recommend a visit to Lake Ashi, where on a clear day you get a picture-perfect view of Mount Fuji, as well as the Onora Observatory and Adawara Art Foundation, which is an exquisite open-air modern art exhibition that is in the Kanagawa Prefecture and a bit further afield, but well worth the trip. Ishikawa Prefecture is another wonderful destination between Tokyo and Kyoto that's great for travelers looking for an off-the-beaten-path ryokan stay with an authentic artisan experience. And along that vein, if you're particularly interested in traditional crafts, Tango is a coastal and mountainous region about 2 hours' drive outside of Kyoto that is chock full of highly skilled and world-renowned craft experiences. Again, we have terrific articles and sample itineraries for all of these regions on Indagare.com for you to reference when planning your time in Japan. And for more insider knowledge and travel tips for Japan and beyond, head to Indagare.com and sign up for our free complimentary weekly newsletter. Join me for more Passport to Everywhere, where I'll be bringing you some of the most inspiring people I have met on my travels. Coming up in the next few weeks, I'll be speaking with Condé Nast Traveler's Global Director, Divya Tani, about India and travel writing. Francisca Mattiola about the golden age of travel and where and how to find glamorous adventures today. And Mary Louise and Roberto Ciao, the father-daughter duo behind the renowned Pelicano hotels in Italy. And don't forget to rate and review us on Apple or Spotify so we can reach more passionate travelers like you. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for joining us at Passport to Everywhere.
We hope you'll join the journey and subscribe. For more travel inspiration, visit Indagare.com. Indagare. This has been Passport to Everywhere.